Hello, everyone, and welcome to ACS webinars, connecting you with the best and brightest minds in chemistry, live from Washington, D.C. I'm Michael David, and I am pleased to be your host for today, which is being co-produced with ACS External Affairs and Communications. Today, we're going to be going over the results of the recent election and what it could mean for the chemical industry. We will be joined by Leah Arinam, the editor-in-chief of the National Journals Hotline, as well as our very own Will Hartwig, a legislative associate at the American Chemical Society. We would love to get you involved in the discussion today, and you can share your thoughts and questions in the questions panel. You can also join the discussion on Twitter by including @AmericChem Society in your tweet. The slides for today's webinar can be accessed right now by clicking the link you see in the GoToWebinar control panel, and an invitation email to view the unedited recording from today's presentation will be sent to all registrants later today. Now, before we get started, I wanted to ask you all a question, and that is, how interested are you in engaging with your elected officials? And here's an interactive window where you can let us know, are you not at all interested, somewhat interested but don't engage, interested but don't know where to start, interested but occasionally engage, or you are very interested and engage whenever possible? I'm seeing some of the results come in. Just a reminder, we are eager to get your questions and comments for the end of the broadcast for your Q&A session, and you don't need to wait until the end of the presentations to start asking. So the earlier you start to ask, the more of a chance we might have to get to your particular question. And with that, I'm going to close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, somewhat interested but don't engage was 31% of our audience. Next up was interested and occasionally engage with 24. The rest were all around the 20s and pretty even. So with that, Will, I am going to turn it over to you to get our presentation started.
Great. So I'm Will Hartwig. I'm a legislative associate at ACS, as Michael already said, and we will hopefully get you a little bit more interested in getting engaged, and we'll hopefully help you figure out how you want to engage based on the following presentation. So real quick, Leah actually is currently editor-in-chief at Hotline, and she's covered congressional, gubernatorial, and presidential races for the last several cycles, so she has broad experience at this, and she's contributed to places like CBS News and 538. So she's going to go ahead and lead us through a little bit of what happened in the 2020 election and prognosticate a bit about what's going to come in the next Congress then. Leah, take it away.
Thanks so much, Will. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm here today to tell you as much as I can about what happened during the 2020 elections. We're going to go through the presidency, the Senate, and the House. And there are a few caveats I want to lay out early on, because you'll notice if you read presidential analysis, if you are a Twitter fan, there are a lot of folks who are really confident that they know exactly what happened and why the results ended up the way they did. And I'm going to add a little bit of humility to that conversation, something that maybe we don't see all that much in DC, but trying to kind of outline what the limitations are to some of that data. So number one, keep in mind, results are still being certified. We are going to show you data that is as recent as, I think, end of November. I'll add in some other information, but we are still seeing results come in and be finalized. Secondly, exit poll data is a little less reliable this cycle than in previous cycles. It's always, should be taken with a grain of salt, but the two major outlets that produce that data, the exit poll data, have pretty strikingly different results this cycle, which means that we're not really sure which one is accurate. And so the best way to get a real picture of that is to kind of dive down into the data at the congressional districts level and the legislative district level. So questions like what districts have a majority minority population, and of those, how many did Biden carry in 2020, and how many did Hillary Clinton carry in 2016? Those are questions that help fill in a lot of those gaps, and we just are still getting finalized data, so we do not have that kind of micro data yet. So keeping that in mind, I can definitely give you some big picture trends that we saw, because we still can learn a lot from what we've seen already. So let's start with the presidential map here. The big picture, Biden rebuilt the blue wall. That came crumbling down when Hillary Clinton lost the presidency in 2016. But at the same time, Biden kind of accelerated realignment for the presidential race. The fact that Arizona and Georgia are both on this map, the fact that Biden flipped both of those, is probably the most surprising or maybe just interesting fact of the night. Arizona, at least in polls, that wasn't totally shocking that Biden did well there. The Senate race was always going to be close. But what Biden's showing us is that possibly the new Democratic coalition is going to move into Arizona and Georgia from places like Ohio and Iowa, places that have become increasingly difficult for Democrats. I was actually saying right before this presentation that one of the more surprising results for me was seeing that Georgia flipped for Democrats and North Carolina didn't. So we'll go a little bit further into that later, and happy to take more questions about that in the Q&A. But major picture is rebuild the blue wall and gave us a semblance of what a future Democratic coalition could look like. So most of, even where Clinton did well in 2016, Biden tended to overperform. So you can kind of see the realignment in states where, in places like even Arizona, Texas, where, especially in Texas actually, where Hillary Clinton lost the state by 9 points in 2016, only for Biden to lose it by 5.5 points in 2020. I know there was a lot of hand wringing on election night when Biden did not win Texas. That was always going to be a fringe state. If Biden had won Texas in 2020, that would mean there was a major Democratic landslide similar to the LBJ landslide in the 1960s. What we saw instead was that in places like Iowa and Ohio, those kind of predominantly white rural states where Trump has a real concrete base of support, where he has his most kind of loyal followers, and places where there used to be an Obama coalition, right? Like those white working class voters who wanted to give Obama a chance, maybe weren't super enthusiastic in 2012 when it came to Obama's reelection, and now have come back into the political scene as some of Trump's biggest supporters. What we saw is a small decrease in places like Iowa and Ohio, where that population is particularly high, but not enough to kind of mark a major change. The major change happened in places like Texas and Arizona, where you see shifts of 4, 3, 5 points, even in places where Biden lost, like Texas, toward Democrats. So basically, all of that's to say, this realignment that you've probably heard about, the Sun Belt states that have growing suburbs, are majority non-white, or at least growing non-white populations. Democrats are making major gains in those states. Sometimes it's enough to push them over the edge in places like Georgia. Sometimes it's not in places like Texas. But they are all adding up to give Biden a bit more of the popular vote than Hillary Clinton got. You see a little bit more of that trend here. This slide shows the margins that Biden got versus those that Hillary Clinton got in 2016 in some of the biggest counties in the country. And you'll notice that in previously pretty blue places, LA, Cook County, there was actually a minor decrease for Democrats. We saw that Biden's coalition seems to have come mostly from places that had been previously, or whose growth came from places that had previously been Republican. So in places like Harris County, Texas, or in Maricopa County, Arizona, which is, basically you can make a game out of how many times pundits say Maricopa County on election night and the days afterward, those changes in margins are where Biden had a kind of new advantage that I find really interesting. The issue for Democrats is that even though Biden was able to get a lot of those former Republicans, people who previously maybe voted for folks like John McCain in Arizona, Mitt Romney Republicans, a lot of them seem like they did not like Trump personally, and therefore they were going to decide that maybe for the first time in their lives or the first time in years, they were going to vote for Biden, someone who had campaigned as relatively moderate and who Cindy McCain decided to support. However, when it came to down ballot races, we did not see that same movement. So that's where a lot of the hand wringing has been among Democrats and strategists and Republicans actually as well, trying to figure out why in places like Nebraska's 2nd district, which is Omaha, why did Joe Biden get that electoral college vote? Because Nebraska too does have a single electoral college vote, one of 2 states, Nebraska, that allocates electoral college votes by congressional district. Why did Biden win that district, but the Democratic nominee lost that district in the House? Why is it that in places like Iowa, which we'll look at a little bit further along, why is it that we saw Joe Biden continue to overperform people who had campaigned as moderates, people who campaigned on issues that were far away from the progressive cries from like defund the police? We also saw people who did use those messages lose. So we're kind of trying to figure out at this point where this ticket splitting happened and why. And that's where that micro data is going to be so important. On that note, it looks like we have a question for the audience before we go any further.
All right, so we just wanted to know, did the results go as you expected with the election? And launch another poll so you can let us know. Is it no, you were shocked? You were mildly surprised, but you made a few accurate predictions in there. You're not surprised and you didn't make any predictions. You were pretty accurate, or you were so good, you should be a pundit. So again, if you just want to let us know, you can click directly on the poll. And I will close this in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It looks like 17% were shocked, 33% were mildly surprised, the same percentage were not surprised and didn't make any predictions. 6% thought they were pretty accurate, and 11% think they should be a pundit. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Leah.
Thank you. That actually sounds relatively similar to probably what the pundit class would also say. Those of you who think that you should be pundits, there was a kind of a range of pretty surprised to, looking at what the map was and looking at the political environment and looking at Trump's approval numbers. The election result made sense. Where things got really weird, though, was down ballot. The Senate ended up being the best case scenario for Republicans. But I want to stress that what happened may have been the best case scenario for Republicans on election day, given that there was a lot of confidence that Democrats would outright win a majority on election day. But a year ago, we were not having this conversation. A year ago, this situation that has arisen would have been not the best case scenario for Republicans, and we'll go into why in a moment. Just a kind of overall summary of where things stand. In the Senate, Democrats lost Alabama. and they picked up Arizona and Colorado. Right now, Democrats have 48 Senate seats and Republicans have 50. Those two that are missing are those Georgia runoffs. In both races, neither candidate hit the 50% mark, and Georgia has a runoff rule where if you don't reach 50%, you try again with the top two vote getters, depending on if it's a special election or regular. So because there's a special election and a regular election happening at the same time, we will not know the Senate majority until January. To be clear, this was on election night. If you were talking to Republicans, they were really thrilled with this outcome. But based on conversations I had with Republicans earlier in the cycle, that's largely because the map and the environment turned so hard against Republicans after the pandemic specifically, but also after Trump's first debate performance and his COVID diagnosis. Let's actually take a look at the next slide, because this goes into that split that we were talking about in the last section. So as I've warned people all through the cycle, the path to the presidency for Biden was not the path to the Democratic Senate majority unless there was a major landslide. So in a situation where Biden, for some reason, was winning places like Texas and South Carolina, that would have given Democrats an outright Senate majority and would have led to the presidency for Biden. But Biden's path throughout the cycle relied on Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. That is where the race was. Toward the end of the election, as things looked really bad for Trump, there was conversations about places like South Carolina and Texas, but that wasn't until the very end of the game there. So in order for the Senate majority in order for Democrats to win the Senate majority, they needed to win states like North Carolina, a state that Joe Biden did not need to win and did not win. Places like Texas, places like Iowa, Montana. There were just so many of them that, looking at the fact that the map was so big and Republicans are playing defense in so many states, it just looks like at least one or two of them statistically, in terms of probability, would flip. But instead, what ended up happening is something else that's pretty common in politics, which is the toss-up races all break the same way, and they all broke toward Republicans. The one that was the most surprising was Maine. You'll see there that the Democratic Senate candidate lost by 8 points in Maine, Sarah Gideon, whereas Biden won the state by 10 points. Now, this is often brought up as an example of where the polling is totally off. I will caution you that in Maine, I do think that the margin is a little bit overblown for Democrats, because Democrats were encouraged by a third-party candidate to put a different name in, Lisa Savage, in first for their ranked choice voting system, something that's Maine has adopted to basically allow voters to pick their first, second, third, fourth choices, and then to put their second choice as Sarah Gideon, the Democrat. What ended up happening is the race did not end up using ranked choice voting because Susan Collins ended up hitting the 50% mark. So if she hits the 50% mark, those second choices never get counted. So if the race had gone to ranked choice voting, I think this would be significantly closer. Just throwing that out there. But the numbers are still pretty striking. The other reason why these numbers are striking is if you look at the Democratic Senate candidate in North Carolina, in Michigan, we're seeing that Biden tended to overperform the Democratic Senate candidate, and that just went completely against the conventional wisdom and the Democratic messaging. Senate Democrats were campaigning on a message that specifically was targeting Trump voters. They tried to stay as local as possible. They tried to avoid talking about progressive policies. You didn't see them congregate around to the Green New Deal, for example. You didn't hear Senate candidates embracing that. But still, despite the fact that in a lot of ways Biden campaigned, I think, a little bit further to the left, these candidates did not do as well as he did. The exception is Arizona. Mark Kelly was always going to do well there. Mark Kelly was always going to win that election. He had been leading in the polls for probably over a year at that point. So that's a little bit of an anomaly. Mark Kelly is an astronaut. Actually, let's talk about Mark Kelly. He's one of the new members who has a background in STEM, in marine engineering, aeronautical engineering, and he was known predominantly as an astronaut, not as a Democrat. And that ended up helping him, especially against Martha McSally, who had really hitched her wagon to Trump very early on in the cycle. And then toward the end, when it looked like he might not win Arizona, had to kind of create some distance. And that's just, in general, really hard for a politician to do. Some of them got away with it this cycle, people like maybe Tom Tillis. Mark Kelly did not. Martha McSally did not, which ended up helping Mark Kelly, who was sworn in today, actually, and will have to face re-election in 2022 because he is filling the late Senator John McCain's seat. The other success story in the Senate for Democrats actually was another STEM candidate, geologist John Hickenlooper, who took his science skills to beer. He opened breweries in Colorado, ended up becoming a successful businessman, and from there ran for governor and senator. Whether his personal candidacy and personal campaign was that important, I'm not sure. Colorado is just a really tough state for Republicans now. Colorado is probably to Republicans at this point what Ohio is to Democrats. So maybe there are a few signs that they could be within reach, but we haven't seen any evidence of that in the last few years. So from there, I can talk about the Senate for a very long time. I won't do that. I'm going to quickly go into the House, but happy to take more questions about the Senate during the Q&A portion. This was the most surprising result of the night. The fact that Republicans and Democrats were preparing for Republicans to lose seats. Republicans have been kind of touting this as a major victory. It looks like they're going to pick up around 10 seats. There are still, I think, 4 races that are uncalled. In one district, Iowa 2nd, the results favor the Republican by 6 votes right now. So we're still getting those final numbers. But the fact that they picked up any seats was really surprising. A year ago, the House was in play. A year ago, it looked like Republicans could be within the realm of possibility of flipping the House. Once the pandemic hit and Trump's numbers started declining, that seemed pretty unlikely. But even though Republicans were not successful in flipping the House, the fact that they picked up seats is basically what all of us people who analyze elections results are trying to figure out right now. On election night, let's take a look at this Florida slide. While the rest of the world was probably a little bit panicked about Biden losing Texas, because that was like the only news on election night, because as we told you for months, it was going to take a while for results to come in and Republicans would look like they were doing better on election night because Republicans were voting in person. We said that for months. And yet on election night, it seems like even a lot of the people who had been saying that for months forgot that they had said that. But so I wasn't surprised when Biden lost Texas. I thought it was completely overblown when people started saying that it was a bad night for Democrats because Trump was going to win Florida. That was always within the realm of possibility. But when the results came out for 2 House races in Miami-Dade County, Florida 26 and Florida 27, that was the moment of the night where I thought this is going to be a big story, and this is the big twist that we will be talking about. If you look at the presidential election vote margin between 2016 and 2020, Trump just made up a lot of grounds in Miami-Dade. And we're seeing that in Miami-Dade, it was him and it was down ballot Republicans who ended up struggling. But as we went through election night, we saw that sometimes Biden would do really well in a district and the Democrat would not. We saw that over and over and over again. So a perfect example of that is Joe Cunningham. Not that Joe Biden did amazingly there, but he did do better in 2020 than he did in 2016. Joe Cunningham was not expected to lose on election night. This was one where it was always kind of at the front of our minds, but because it was such a tough district, but Republicans and Democrats put that one pretty far down the list. So as you are listening to people try to figure out what happened in these down ballot races on election night, there are a few theories. One is that progressive messaging hurt down ballot candidates more than it hurt Biden. So Biden had already established this brand. And so Republicans coming after him and comparing him to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't work, but maybe it worked for somebody like Joe Cunningham, who 99% of the population, I think, would not recognize in the grocery store, at least nationally, maybe in the district, a little bit better than that. Another reason that possibly this happened, people thought Biden would win, and so they voted for a check on him. We saw that in 2016, a bunch of Republicans won in districts that Hillary Clinton carried because people thought Hillary Clinton would win. When Hillary Clinton didn't win, they all lost their seats in 2018. And then another theory is just Republicans were significantly better at recruiting this cycle. A lot of their incumbents in 2018 were pretty lackluster personalities, and they were replaced with young, diverse, for the most part, challengers in 2020. So we can go into the holes in all of those theories. We're still trying to figure out what happened. There's probably a little bit of truth in each of them, but whatever politicos think happened, whatever the campaigns and strategists think happened, is going to determine how they campaign in 2022 and 2024. So with that, I'm going to toss it back over for a question from you guys, and we'll do Q&A in a little bit.
All right, so the question, a little bit of congressional trivia. Select which of the following are real congressional caucuses. And you can select as many as you would like on this. You're not limited to just one. So is the Congressional Battlefield Caucus a thing? Congressional High Performance Building Caucus, Congressional Critical Materials Caucus, the Congressional Chemistry Caucus, and the Congressional Hockey Caucus, which I assume can have some pretty ruckus meetings. And I'm seeing some results come in. Just a reminder, we're going to get to that Q&A session soon, and we are eager to get your questions and comments. So getting those in now would be a good time. And with that, I'm going to close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, we had 28 say the Congressional Battlefield Caucus was a thing. 45% said the High Performance Building Caucus. 55% for the Congressional Critical Materials Caucus. 91% for the Congressional Chemistry Caucus. That's a good one to see. And 18% for the Hockey Caucus. So with that, Will, I'm going to turn it over to you to reveal the results and say a few words.
So thanks, Mike. So the correct answer is all of those are actually caucuses. And the critical materials one actually just launched earlier this year. So that's exciting to see that. Moving on to the next slide then. So we've discussed the results of the election, and now we would like to just highlight a little bit of how chemistry the enterprise at large is impacted by these election results. And so we've got a few different bullets here that you can kind of see. And so I think the one that's the easiest to grasp and the most direct is that obviously funding levels are set by Congress and the president together in concert. So that will impact how much research funding there is at the National Science Foundation or the Department of Energy. There's also going to be potentially a shift in high-level research initiatives and what's prioritized in terms of, say, something like there's been a push for quantum computing or artificial intelligence or machine learning over the last several years. But the precise mix of how much funding goes to which of those or what sort of initiatives are launched is going to change as there's a different congressional makeup and a different administration in office. So that's another area. STEM education, obviously, there's a wide-ranging set of views on how STEM education should be carried out and how K through 12 education should be carried out. And so we will probably see some changes there, just as there's a new Secretary of Education and also in higher education. And then, of course, I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about how this ties back to chemistry, but just in society at large is energy and environment issues. Are there going to be shifts in terms of regulations on chemicals? What about any potential changes in climate change as a driver for new policies? And so all these are different areas that we're going to be watching now that we expect to see change since the election, basically. Next slide, please. So how the American Chemical Society gets involved is we work with members of Congress on ACS priorities in a couple different ways. So I'm actually a registered lobbyist, and I go out and lobby on behalf of you, our members. And that can take the form of in-person meetings. That can also be grassroots outreach where we help you guys get organized. I'm seeing that the slides aren't showing up.
Sorry, well, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and try sharing it again, see if that'll jumpstart it. All right, are they back on your end?
I can see them. Let's see. Sorry, everybody. We'll just go ahead and, well, you'll just have to listen to my dulcet tones in the interim, I suppose.
We'll try and get it worked out in the meantime.
So in addition to working with Congress, both directly as a lobbyist and also with you guys, the members, and grassroots outreach where you write to members of Congress with our help, we also work with executive branch agencies a lot. So that sometimes is in-person meetings where we go meet with people that are career officials at different agencies, such as the Department of Energy, and learn about their priorities and express our interest in those priorities and how ACS can help with those or our members' priorities. And then we will also submit comments. So if you could see the slide, we have a screen cap of a comment we submitted on a recent EPA rule regarding methane emissions. And you can find out more about all of this at www.acs.org/policy. That's our website where you can go to see what we've done in terms of comments. You can also sign up for Act for Chemistry, which is our grassroots advocacy organization of sorts. So that's where we would help you write to members of Congress on important issues of the day. You can look up who your member is and who your senator is so that you can contact them. And we're also working on highlighting more opportunities to comment directly with federal agencies on issues that we think are important to our members. And one last thing I want to highlight is that Chemistry Caucus, which 91% of you got, is a real caucus. And so after the last election, we currently have just over 60 members split between the House and Senate, and that's covering 25 different states as of November 2020. And the Chemistry Caucus is a useful group for us because they are a ready-made audience for our events if we want to hold briefings to discuss different issues with members of Congress. They also help us when we do get to have in-person events on the Hill. They help us arrange space and highlight those and promote them so that we can get a wider attendance. So we're not just preaching to the choir, if you will. And you can go to our website again, acs.org/policy, and you can find this map that actually lists all the different members and senators who are part of the caucus. And if your senator and or representative are not, you can contact them, and that can be one way to kind of get started interacting with your elected officials, is contacting them to ask them to consider joining the caucus. Next slide, please. So we have another survey question coming up, and it's after this election, how involved do you plan to be in politics? So I'll let Mike take that.
All right, so a simple enough question. Are you less interested in interacting with your elected officials? Don't really imagine much of a change in your involvement. You're more interested in interacting with those elected officials, or you know what, you plan to run for office. And again, you can just respond on screen, and I will close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, it looks like no one is less interested in interacting, which is good. 47% said they don't anticipate any change in their involvement. Another 47% say they are more interested in interacting. And 5% plan to run for an office. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Will.
Great. Well, hopefully we can help those of you that are more interested in interacting at Act for Chemistry. So you can join. It's an email list where we will send out alerts, and we also send out a quarterly newsletter kind of highlighting what's been going on in DC. You can see the website right there. And we also have a Twitter account that you can follow on Act for Chemistry on Twitter, and that's probably the most up-to-date. Like, we send out tweets pretty frequently about issues that we think our members are interested in. So with that, I believe we are now at question and answer time. So we'll go ahead and start going through a few of those. So we have a variety of questions on the election results, and then some discussion about what's going to happen in the next Congress. So we'll just start off with a question we have about, did relocation of people from California to Arizona and Nevada influence the changes seen in those states from 2016 to 2020?
That's a good question. Again, I can't say for sure that happened, but something happened in Maricopa County. And I have a feeling it was a confluence of factors. So that might be people moving in from California. That was definitely a major concern among Republicans before the election. Some of it could be people moving in from other states. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll have a little bit more concrete data on, like I mentioned, the congressional level, so that we can see how many people who, voted for Biden actually were born in Arizona, those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever's happening, the population is changing. And so it's, yes, California has something to do with that, but so does the fact that, the economy is becoming more and more focused on jobs that are focused in the suburbs and big cities.
Great. We have a few different questions that are curious about what you think the chances are of Georgia's, how do you think Georgia's elections are going to turn out for senator in January? Like, two Democrats, split, both Republicans?
Tell you exactly what will happen. So let's start with the fact that this weekend, Donald Trump will be going to Georgia. Mike Pence is going this week as well. And right now, there's kind of an internal Republican civil war in Georgia. The Secretary of State and some elections administrators, the governor's been pretty silent, but they've all ended up on Trump's bad side. The governor has been silent, but Trump has still called him out for that silence, because they are trying to affirm confidence in the election. And they're frustrated that Trump is saying that these results are not accurate, or that there's fraud when there's no evidence for that. So basically right now, Republicans are trying to give off two messages. One, voting is just fraudulent, and this election was rigged and your vote didn't matter. And two, you need to go to the polls in Georgia so that you can prevent Chuck Schumer from being majority leader. And those two ideas don't really work well together. Now, by election day, will Trump, I don't think he'll ever concede. He actually said that himself the other day. But maybe the attention will kind of, start going more toward Joe Biden than toward him. You're already beginning to see that. It's possible that that kind of election fraud narrative starts to dissipate. If it doesn't, it's Republicans who are embracing that, and that is probably Democrats' best chance at this point of winning. So, I mean, Democrats are probably better positioned in terms of the actual, in terms of what is happening, but Georgia is still, it's not a blue state. It's not even a purple state, really. It's, as of the election, a light red state. If the Senate races go toward Democrats, we can start calling it purple. But until then, Republicans just have had a fundamental advantage there.
Thank you. We have a question about thoughts on who might replace Senator Harris in California. So any insight there on who Governor Newsom might tap?
Yeah, this is actually something that we cover a bit in the newsletter in the mornings. So Gavin Newsom is facing pressure to appoint a Hispanic senator, but he's also getting pressure to replace Kamala Harris with another woman. He's getting pressure to, from progressives. There's a whole lot of different pressure that he's facing, and it seems like he's not in a rush to appoint someone. So his options are, appoint somebody who's kind of a placeholder for a little while and then allow a primary to take place, or choose somebody who will run for a full term. You might not even remember, but after John McCain died, there was a senator before Martha McSally for a couple months who was just not going to run for a full term. So, I mean, the name that we keep hearing is Alex Padilla, but we've also heard things about, Katie Porter for years, Congresswoman there. There are a lot of names floating around, so hopefully we'll start to see those narrow in the next couple weeks.
Thank you. We've got a bunch of different questions about 2021, so we'll move on to that now. And so one question is what we think the longer term regulatory climate will be regarding the chemical industry in light of the new administration. And in particular, do we foresee regulations tightening or relaxing? And I think that we'll have to see what the makeup of Congress is first, because that's going to impact what the new administration has purview to do. There's a potential for a lot of Congressional Review Act votes, which would undo Trump administration initiatives pretty quickly, provided that control of the Senate flips. But otherwise, I think we're still waiting to see how exactly the Senate shakes out before we know really what the new administration will have leeway to do. We have a question on, should we expect a shift in policies toward having more chemistry industry production facilities in the US? I think this goes into the supply chain challenges we've seen as a result of COVID-19. So that will really depend on what Congress decides to do in response. I know that there is a lot of interest in that particular issue, and also there's a recognition that maybe we've moved too far in the direction of just-in-time supply chains that are a little bit too focused on too few sources. So we'll have to see what sort of solutions Congress proposes to that before we can figure out what might happen in terms of production facilities being onshored or the chem job market. We've got another one about the outlook for federal funding for scientific research. And what the impact is going to be after all of the COVID packages from this past year. It seems pretty likely that there'll be a new recognition of the importance of the deficit in the new Congress. And so I think that that could potentially drive, at the very least, a leveling off in terms of how much funding Congress is comfortable providing for discretionary spending. Lots of questions here about COVID research. So worries about non-COVID research having a harder time being funded in comparison to COVID-19 based research. That's really going to depend on the funding agencies. Obviously, that's kind of independent of Congress and somewhat the administration by design insofar as the grant review committees. So it's hard to say how that might occur. Are there legislative science priorities that Congress and the Trump administration are trying to complete before the end of their terms? So I would say right now, and Leah can correct me if I'm forgetting anything, but Congress right now is pretty focused on passing the Defense Authorization Act and finishing funding for at least the rest of this year. And I don't know that there's much appetite for much more than that right now. Would you agree?
Yep, that sounds right. And COVID relief in general.
Yeah, and so in terms of the Trump administration, we're monitoring that and we expect to see more activity there, but we're still waiting to see what all they might try and do, push out before the inauguration. We've got a question about national debt potentially hurting the domestic chemical industry. That's a difficult question to answer. I mean, that's a lot of economics, and I know we have a couple webinars each year on the economics of the chemical enterprise, so that might be a better question for there. And how can ACS members get involved with new Congress and president? Well, I would encourage you all to follow us on Twitter at Act for Chemistry and sign up for our newsletter. And let's see here. We've got a few questions that don't quite fit into the other two categories. So we have a question about how often do ACS reps give testimony to Congress? So in that particular case, we don't usually testify directly to Congress. As you can imagine, they don't necessarily like having lobbyists as witnesses at congressional hearings. What we do often do is meet with staff and provide feedback or expertise or point them in the direction of information they might need in terms of whatever the issue of the day might be or a particular bill. And we might even help on occasion with drafting language on a bill. We've definitely worked on getting some language regarding sustainable chemistry in a variety of different bills this year. We're hopeful that Sustainable Chemistry Research and Development Act will actually pass, which is going to be a huge thing for the ACS this year as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. We have a question about how we ended up in policy and if we would change our academic career and how we ended up in this particular area. So I am a chemistry PhD and I did a fellowship actually that the American Chemical Society sponsors in Congress. So applications for those are open right now, actually. You can find them on the policy website. And there's also a science policy one where you can work in Washington, D.C. at the American Chemical Society and do things like host a webinar, for example. I think we are kind of running up on time here. We do have a question about NIH funding, and there's a question about doubling NIH funding. So I think that NIH is one of the most reliably funded research agencies at the federal level. Their budget for this year is over $40 billion, and I don't foresee that being doubled anytime soon. It's actually was doubled or nearly doubled about a decade ago previously, so I doubt we'll see any increase that large again anytime soon. So with that, I think we'll go to maybe final thoughts. So Leah, do you have any final thoughts on the election or where you think things will go in 2021?
I think I just point people to pay attention to governor's races in 2022 and to pay attention to redistricting in 2021. Those will, determine who is actually in Congress. And even though governor's races were pretty slow this year, there is going to be a lot to watch in 2022.
Great. My last thought for everyone is just to make sure if you're at all interested, go ahead and sign up for Act for Chemistry and follow us on Twitter so that you can stay on top of all the chemistry specific developments. And with that, I will pass it back to Mike.
All right, well, Will and Leah, thank you so much for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. We're going to be winding down our broadcasts here for the end of the year, but we are planning a lot for 2021. We hope you join us then. Coming up on Thursday, December 10th, we will be joined by Peter Mahaffey and Mary Kay Orgill for a look at systems thinking in chemistry education and preparing global citizens for a sustainable future. The next week, on December 17th, join Dr. Victor McRae, Vice Chair of the National Science Board, and Dr. Barbara Swary Director at Large of the ACS Board of Directors, for a conversation regarding actionable steps on how the US can continue to lead in fundamental research and remain a global leader for innovation in 2030. We would love to hear your feedback. You can reach out to us through the ACS social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or by email at acswebinars@acs.org. And of course, we are always curious to hear what you thought of today's broadcast. A short survey will pop up directly after the webinar that will take just a minute to complete. Also remember that an invitation email to view the recording from today's presentation will be sent to all registrants. It'll be open for a 24-hour period, after which it will be removed, edited, and become an ACS member benefit. And that wraps up our program for today. On behalf of all of us here at ACS, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you next week, and until then, stay safe and stay healthy.